Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch. My guest today is Dr Lawrence Newport, head of campaign organisation Crush Crime and also co-founder of the political movement Looking for Growth. We spoke today about crime, why the vast majority of it goes unpunished in Britain, not just sexual crime, but all kinds of crime, why forensic technology is massively underutilised, the elite belief that worrying about crime is low status, and why rehabilitation should not be the primary goal of the criminal justice system. The extended version of this episode, as ever, is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can find all of the other stuff I put on the Substack, my writing, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, the live streams I do occasionally with other Substackers. The MMM chat community is also on there. It's very lively. All available at louiseperry.substack.com. You can also buy now, a quick reminder, the young adult edition of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. When the original edition first came out, I had parents contacting me saying that they would like to give it to their children, but they felt like it was too much for them. It was too long and too difficult and too distressing. So this is a new edit. It's half the length. I had lots of the graphic stuff removed. It's intended to be read by teenagers between about 15 and 17, maybe younger, depending on parental judgment. If you know a young person who you think could benefit from reading it, please do consider buying a copy. Lawrence, feminists have talked for years, decades, about the failures of the criminal justice system relating to sexual violence. And they are completely right. This is probably out of date, but my memory is that something like less than 1% of rapes in this country end with a prison sentence because of multiple layers of attrition, right, which I'm sure we'll go into. One of the things, though, that I realised from gaining greater knowledge about crime in general is that actually rape is not unique in this regard. Like, feminists are completely right. And there are some specific issues relating to sexual violence, which are maybe more in terms of like re-traumatizing victims through the criminal justice system. And, there are some specific points that are true for sexual violence more than for other crimes. But actually, when you look in detail at the British criminal justice system in general, and we're not unique in this regard, it's kind of true for everything. Actually, the number of serious crimes for which the offender suffers no consequences, basically, is startling.
I think this is one of the most shocking aspects, actually, of looking into the criminal justice system. And in fact, there are multiple shocking aspects, but one of them is this, that so much of crime is, or rather goes without punishment.
Yeah.
In fact, in reality, it's really the vast majority of crime goes without any real punishment at all. This is because, obviously, there are many, many, many parts at which the system can fail and, in fact, continuously does. Mm-hmm. One is simply, the first stage is reporting crimes. There is a large amount of crime which is simply never reported. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason for this is because of other failures in the system, like a lack of belief that the police will follow it up, a lack of belief that the courts will do anything about it, and so on and so forth. So last year we saw around about just over 5 million crimes in this country, but that is reported to police. There are estimates. We've come up with an estimate of around about 13 million crimes in the country overall. Mm-hmm. There are several reasons for this. There are some stats that you can draw out that, for instance, people stating that they have been a victim of crime, but then stating that they haven't reported that crime. You can start to make estimates of how many are never reported. Mm. And things like with bike thefts, there are some stats showing between 50 and 70% of people who've had their bike stolen just don't bother reporting it. They just don't believe something's going to happen. So all of these crimes, so of those reported, these are the only ones that the police actually have any ability to follow up on. And only a fraction of those end with a suspect identified. Mm-hmm. I believe in theft from the person. So when someone just steals like a handbag, or now very frequently steals a mobile phone, it's 1% or less end in a suspect identified. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge attrition rate. With bike theft, I think it's like 2% or so. There are multiple categories of crime where there is no suspect ever identified. Then there are all the categories where a suspect is indeed identified but not charged. This is for multiple different reasons, CPS and others. It is then whether or not that person charged If the case actually manages to go to court, and there are huge court delays now that take potentially years before a trial, before anyone sees a trial. This is, of course, particularly awful in rape cases where people can wait up 3 to 4 years from the moment they reported to actually having a trial, which is completely and utterly unforgivable, really. And the longer that takes, the more people drop out of the system. We can see why, particularly in rape cases, the stress, the constant concern about what's going to happen, the constant delays, because also it might appear that a trial is about to begin and then a significant percentage are delayed on the first day. They go to court and then said, actually, we're going to delay further, which leads to many cases, and indeed many rape cases, collapsing as a result. So you can end up with, it really is an absolutely minuscule fraction of crime that ends in a prison sentence. So of that 13 million, we're looking at maybe 70,000 or more that end in a prison sentence. So it is an absolute monumental difference between the number of people sent to prison and the actual number of crimes in this country.
To be a little bit inside baseball for a moment, this Crime Survey England and Wales, right? Am I right? Is it still the case that, so this is a survey that's done, it's kind of got nothing to do with police, in the sense that it's just asking people directly, have you been a victim of crime in the last 12 months? And if so, what type of crime, etc. This is supposedly the best measure we have of how much crime is happening. Is it still the case, though, that you're capped in terms of the number of crimes that you can report to the Crime Survey England and Wales? Because I remember this being an issue with domestic violence victims in particular. There was a cap of, I think, 5.
I actually don't know this. I don't know. I didn't know there was a cap.
Yeah.
Now, that might be because there isn't any more.
There certainly was some years ago, but I haven't looked very recently.
I would have to find that. I don't know. If that's the case, I should make that a big...
I'm glad to be helping.
Speaking of podcasts now, I should make this a big thing. Like that would be horrendous. If that is actually the case, that is, which if it was, should be, hopefully has been changed, and if it hasn't, it needs to be changed immediately.
My memory is that it was 5, which means that because
mad.
some people will easily be a victim of more than 5 crimes. It's particularly domestic stuff, or if you're a prostitute, or like there are all sorts of people who are just victims of crime all the time. Yeah, it massively warps the numbers. The reason that they did this was because they didn't want to warp the numbers through having these outlier victims, but also like the outlier victims are real. So
yeah, that's very, very normal. That's a power law.
Yeah,
you should expect that.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, hang on. I'm actually going to ask one of my researchers right now to, not necessarily for this podcast, but I want to know if that's the case, because that is absolutely horrific if that's the case.
This is honestly one of these cases where I think there hasn't been a lot of communication between like feminists who are obsessed with violence against women and right-wing policy wonks. And actually we have there's a lot in common. I'm that weird nexus of the two groups. And
yeah, it's one of the strangest things is that, you know, our court system collapse is particularly bad for rape cases, and yet it's not something talked about through that lens beforehand. Like, well, actually, that's not true. There are some groups that do talk about it in that way, but not many.
Yeah,
you know, like Rape Crisis really understands that there's a real problem with the courts.
I have often been frustrated with other feminists on this point, because what's quite common is it's because there are basically 2 different groups at play who are very upset about crime. Like, one category is basically people on the right who are law and order about this, right? And then the other group is feminists who are specifically concerned with certain types of crime against women and children. And there can be animosity directed from the feminists towards the right. I'm unusually in the Venn diagram, right? Like a foot in both camps. And something I do get frustrated with feminists about sometimes is, we know all of this. We know about the attrition rate. We know about how awful it is for victims when they have to wait years and years for stuff to come to trial. We know that the perpetrators just get away with it again and again and again and again. But there's a real reluctance among a lot of feminists to agree with the right that actually what we need to be doing is basically removing criminals from the general population, that long prison sentences are the best policy we have to actually protect victims. And there's a real squeamishness around that. So I don't think that there's been enough joining forces, basically, between the law and order wonks and the women's sector.
I think there is actually also a burgeoning and widening coalition on this in general, actually, as well. And on this, I mean on criminal justice, on imprisoning, certainly repeat offenders, certainly the most serious offenders. I think this actually is a long lag from Westminster and kind of elites to some extent who've split into many, many different camps on an issue that in general the British public is pretty unified on.
More unified than on almost anything. Like it's really hard to find a poll that people are more in agreement on than anything to do with crime.
Yeah, and I think also people's experiences with crime changes their attitude to it very dramatically. I know from my campaigning at Crush Crime the amount of people who've reached out from all kind of different walks of life, all kind of different political groups and political persuasions and political beliefs. They are all actually quite united in, I don't want to live in a country where I have to be afraid, that I have to feel a real sense of injustice repeatedly at either continued repeat offenders getting no prison sentence or getting incredibly minimal sentences, or on for extremely serious offenders to be avoiding prison or getting very, very, very short sentences compared to the level of harm. One of the cases, actually, that when I launched the campaign, one of the cases I brought attention to was one in which a man had about 20 previous offences. I think about 3 or 4 of them were violent offences, and he beat his girlfriend so badly that she wrote his name in blood on the wall because she thought she would die from her injuries. And I believe it was about 3.5 years he was given in prison. 20 previous offences, beat someone that badly, several previous violent offences. I think if you were to tell most people, they would automatically assume, well, this person's obviously going to go away for like 20 years or more. And that isn't the case. 3.5 years means very likely out in around about 2. It is completely and utterly unacceptable. And there is a very large coalition here across the board where I think most people are able to look at this and say, well, it's hard to justify why that is the case and why we should allow that and why we should accept that.
There are multiple cases that you have to see to believe them. I mean, Ed West, who's a mutual friend of ours, he keeps this famous Twitter thread where he lists like egregious cases of under-sentencing. And many of them I send this thread to people all the time. Less so now that Elon has annoyingly made it impossible to share threads if people don't have Twitter accounts, which is honestly his worst intervention. But they're incredible, and there are so many cases of it, like for instance on domestic violence, which is a classic case of repeat offending with different women as well as with the same woman.
Exactly.
Men who will kill a woman, go to prison briefly, come out, kill another woman, go to prison briefly. I wish I was exaggerating, but this really does go on. And I think that the public generally don't know quite how bad it is. They have the sense that it's bad. They're directionally correct. And they will give, when they're asked, what do you want to do about this? Again, they will give directionally correct answers. But I don't think it's been in the interest of any political party that's been in power to actually tell us what's going on.
And it's so extremely bad. Like once you look into these cases, exactly as you said, like it is really a continuous shock that these sentences that originally you might think, well, it must be particularly complex, there must be good reasons. No, this is just, unfortunately, the state of our justice system. We can come up with many different reasons why. There are some ideological reasons why particular judges might not want to do this. There is, as you said, there was particular movement for a while away from prison sentences, which they even applied to some very, very, very particularly bad examples of offenders. But it is also the case that no government, certainly for a very, very long period of time, has actually looked at this from a lens of how do we firstly protect the public and firstly stop these people being able to do this. Instead, all discussions come around deterrence versus rehabilitation, all of which are very, very good things to discuss and to talk about. But a big message from the Crush Crime campaign is the first duty of government is to protect the public. And in cases, of course, of domestic violence, rape, sexual offences. These are people, many of which have many previous offences of this type. It is saying you need to protect the public from these people. Then we can talk about rehabilitation or other such programs. But the first duty is protecting the public. Otherwise, as you say, these horrendous cases where people go on to repeatedly do this and the system keeps giving them more chances, which means that the public, and of course, in the case of domestic violence and in the case of many rapes, their partners or those near them are constantly put at risk.
Yeah. I mean, this is political philosophy 101. It's like the most fundamental task of the state is to protect the nation from like invasion and to protect people from violence within its borders. And
Yes.
like really everything else is secondary. That's the only thing that basically everyone within the political philosophy agrees that is the duty of the state and
Yes.
and is a legitimate reason to raise taxes.
Yes.
And that's precisely what is not happening.
Yeah.
And
yes.
And the
and they
public are
feel
noticing.
incredibly, I was going to say disappointed, but disappointed really is not the word. Angry, frustrated is extremely difficult to, for example, when there was a recent case, someone alerted me to a burglary that they had. They are very much not, shall we say, right-wing, thinking about law and order in that way. But the experience of burglary, of someone going to their home, they said, this is extremely, extremely bad. And the response from police, so disappointing. I am absolutely terrified about law and order in this country. Why isn't the government helping people? Why aren't they stepping up? Why do I now have to think about how am I going to protect my house and my family? This is a failure, fundamental failure of government. And I can see it too when, not nearly as serious a crime as burglary or but still like an invasion. Phone theft. My sister-in-law had her phone stolen about 2.5 months ago. So she was caring for her 2 toddlers, and she turned her back to, I think she was on Westminster Bridge, and someone just took it right out of her pocket and ran with it. Within a few hours, it ended up in a phone shop. Within a few hours after that, someone's house, and a few days after that, it was in China. But I posted this online. I said, the police haven't been very helpful. This has all been like incredibly difficult. If you're now a mother just caring for her children in a public space, you're a target because you're distracted. But the responses that I got from people, both privately and public, in replies and otherwise, was people saying, if you've got the address where it is now, because this was when it was still in London, I said, we've got the GPS address. Multiple people saying, give me the address. I'll sort it out.
Vigilantism.
And this is like, it's just groups of, angry people who are incredibly frustrated. And, government, if they're failing this duty, they need to immediately reconcile with this, get back to focusing on protecting the public, because anger and frustration, this is real, and people feel afraid, they feel not listened to. It is very, very difficult for the general public to hear things like there are offenders with 10 or more offences who are regularly avoiding prison. I think most people would not even believe that, let alone saying, and many of these have violent offences in their past, and still they may only get a year or 2, even if they're beating someone nearly to death. It would astound people, and yet that is the case.
I read an article in the Times some weeks ago, you might have seen it because it was quite a big weekend piece, about Brits moving to Dubai. There are now something like 250,000 Brits living in Dubai, and it was interviews with various people who are living there, and there was a line in it which really jumped out at me, has been kind of rattling around in my head ever since, where one of the women who's moved there with her family was asked, Dubai is famously low crime because they are very, very strict on it, basically, and they'll literally cut off people's hands, and but they don't have any crime, or they certainly don't have any of the kind of street crime which really stresses people out here. And the journalist asked this woman, do you not feel like your freedom is restricted in Dubai because you can't drink in most places? People have been prosecuted for having extramarital sex and stuff like that. Do you not worry about your freedom? And she said, I don't feel free in Britain because I'm so frightened of crime all the time. I feel freer here, where you have that kind of authoritarian government, than I do in my own country, where I can't, go out with my toddlers, your example, right, without fear of getting my phone snatched, or fear of being violently assaulted in any given place, And that's really stuck with me, because actually it's not as though they're different types of government misbehaviour, let's say, right? It is clearly different what the British government is doing, and this would also apply to the American government in many cases. And there are lots of other governments who are in this space of being too liberal. They're not persecuting their citizens actively in this way. They're doing it passively. They're failing to protect people from groups and individuals who will cause the most horrendous harm to completely innocent people. And those completely innocent people will have their freedom restricted because they're so frightened of crime. And yet, because it's passive, because it's caused by inaction generally, we don't tend to regard it as tyrannical. But I would say it's functionally is.
I think it's such an awful failure. It's just such an awful failure. Like, the one thing you hope for is, if you're going to call the police, that there's an investigation, that if they find who's at fault, or believe they found who's at fault, that there is a speedy trial. And in fact, we know, of course, that one way of stopping people becoming career criminals, who have dozens of offences to their name, is very early intervention, by which some of the best methods are getting them, catching them, and then getting them on trial quickly.
Yeah.
So they see a quick feedback loop. We have completely abandoned this. I mean, this is, when we're talking 3 to 4 years for rape trials, when they're collapsing due to witnesses dropping out, due to the kind of horrendous stress that people are under, it is a complete failure of the state, and it's a complete failure of expectations. And it is very, very difficult. I even had this with the, so at Crush Crime, we did a video in which I'd heard from so many people that the police aren't investigating a whole ream of different crimes, one of which was bike theft. So I bought a bike, I chained it just outside Scotland Yard and left it there for not very long at all. We put 2 GPSs, one in the handlebars and one under the seat, because we thought, well, if someone finds one in the handlebars, they'll think that they found the tracker. But that was too much. They never found either tracker, so
didn't even bother. Okay.
But yes, so we left it there. It was taken right outside Scotland Yard.
Sorry to interrupt you, but just for listeners who don't know, Scotland Yard is the headquarters of London's police.
Yes.
Yes.
A very iconic building right next to Parliament as well. So it's right next to Parliament. Yes, the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police. It was stolen directly outside. There are CCTV cameras all over that area, which is also why we picked it. I reported it stolen and said, look, I've got the GPS signal. I can show you where it's going around London. I can show you where it's spending its evenings. You're covered in CCTV here. Please let me know. Within 24 hours, I just got a text saying, sorry, we're actually going to shut this case. Handcheck CCTV.
Here's your crime number.
Yes. Handcheck CCTV, hadn't gone off the GPS signal, absolutely nothing, weren't going to follow up at all. What's stunning about this, obviously, is like, yes, the fact that London's got so much CCTV and they're not using it, but it's also the fact that several people I talked to are officers who I said, well, what if you lose your bike? What are they doing? And they walked me through the process. They said, well, they'll check some CCTV, they'll check this, they'll check. Something I did get was a lot of messages from police officers after that saying to me, even I am surprised that we're not doing that. Even I am surprised at that. And that, I think, shows you just the level at which there is failure here, and there's a failure from the state. And as you say, like a failure of expectations, that people are kind of left to themselves and left on your own. And if this happens to you, this is why so many people aren't reporting these events. And of course, with very serious crimes, extremely serious crimes like domestic violence and otherwise, people not reporting crimes because they don't believe anything will happen, or they believe it will take years and there's not much point, is extremely, extremely bad. And of course, there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of people in that exact position making that exact choice, because our state is indeed failing them.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions, which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. My dad got thousands of pounds worth of bikes stolen from his shed recently when we were staying at my parents' house. And this is not the first time having had bikes stolen. And, behind a locked gate in a locked shed, we had CCTV in the shed, belt and braces, right? From the owner's perspective. The bikes got nicked. And while we were staying there, the police came round, but they didn't really do anything. And actually, because they said, it was too cold to get fingerprints, and there's no point getting forensics on the shoe prints, because what if they're wearing different shoes on another day? They basically didn't take any forensic evidence. They did come round, which is quite impressive, right? Like that doesn't always happen. Yeah. And the police officer said to me, actually, as he was leaving, keep an eye out on places where these things are sold, like Gumtree or whatever. And if you see it, turn up, say that you're interested in buying, or not you personally, but your husband and one of his biggest friends show up. Literally, he basically suggested vigilantism.
Wow,
that was his prescription.
My goodness.
Yeah,
okay.
That was one notable thing about this event. And the second notable thing about this event is that my 3-year-old spent weeks talking about this. Because he was so, we obviously tried to soften it for him as much as possible, but he was so rattled at the idea of someone. I mean, it was so poignant. Honestly, he'd be sitting in the car and he'd be like, "I'm going to keep my eyes peeled for that naughty burglar," because he was, that burglar stole Bubba's bikes, and he just went on about it for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it made you realise that we've kind of got used to this.
But
actually, you see
we become acclimatized.
Yeah, but you see it through a child's eyes, and you think. And he kept asking, like, when are they going to catch the burglar? And we had to just say, don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very good question.
Yeah, the 3-year-old is right.
It is the right question. When are they going to catch them? And unfortunately, trying to say, well, in like over 90% of cases, but this is the real potential here. However, is that though the system is of course breaking apart, and there is failures, like very, very serious ones. Part of the reason of starting up Crush Crime is my strong conviction that by pushing, by being loud, by being consistent, by focusing on the data, and by not letting this drop out of salience for politicians, there is a way of actually trying to force through change and response. And actually, over the last few months, we've seen that at the campaign. One of the ways that we've seen that is just in the last few weeks, the Met, after much talk of how difficult it is to catch phone thieves and so forth, they did a special operation and arrested 230 people for phone theft in a single week, and shut down a phone shop that they had strong suspicion was some kind of fencing operation. This is clearly something that they could be doing more of. It is actually possible. But in response to months of pressure, they did actually act. Similarly as well, we've had changes from the government, and indeed the Conservative Party have adopted several of our policy suggestions. It is something which I believe can change. And I think the fact that it is quite unifying, it is something where people look to crime and nobody wants, really, there is very, very, very small number of people who want repeat offenders to not face prison time, that want serious offenders to not face prison time. Most people look at this and say, if you are a domestic abuser, if you are a rapist, if you are even worse, repeatedly guilty of these offences, which of course are just the offences that you've been proved to be guilty of. We also know from many statistics as well that people in prisons and otherwise report up to sometimes 25 other crimes per crime that they've been found guilty of, that they have also done. So it is obviously only the tip of the iceberg, even for people who have dozens or hundreds of offences. We are certainly not catching them every single time. So given this, it makes complete sense that the general public's view, indeed expressed very well by your 3-year-old there, why aren't they catching them and then what are they going to do about it, is the right question to ask, and is something which I think we can demand of the system. It's something we should expect, and it's something which really politicians don't have a good answer for if they're not delivering on, because obviously they should be delivering on this thing.
My theory about why there's a big ideological story going on, right, in terms of basically politicians being much further to the left than the public are on criminal justice, and that's been true for a long time. And it has, as far as I'm aware, it has always been the case ever since capital punishment was abolished in the 60s. The public has never actually not had majority support for the return of capital punishment, at least for certain categories of crime. Sometimes you ask people, YouGov have a tracker, sometimes you ask people, do you want to bring back capital punishment? And they're like, no. But then you say, oh, but what about someone who kills a child? And they're like, oh, yeah, definitely. What about someone who's a terrorist? Like, oh, yeah, definitely. The gap between public opinion and parliamentary opinion on this is enormous. So a big part of the story is ideological, right? I do also think that some of it is just to do with the short time horizons of politicians, because the crime rate is very bad, right? But it's not the worst. It's not enormously worse than it was in, say, the 90s. It's fluctuated. It's a lot worse now than it was in, say, the 1950s, a lot worse. But in terms of recent decades, it kind of goes up and down, and it depends on type of crime or stuff. You might have a different view on this. We can talk about the numbers in a minute. But I think the crucial thing that politicians have never really wrapped their heads around is that since the forensics revolution and since CCTV became ubiquitous, it has become possible for us to catch almost everyone. Like, we really do. If we put the resources into burglaries that we put into murders, there would be no burglaries anymore, because, as you've been alluding to, a small number of recidivists are overwhelmingly responsible for all crime. And actually, we could eradicate this. We totally could. Like, there would be no guesswork. The risk of false convictions would be extraordinarily low. We have so many technological resources available to us, and we've never actually made a decision, or government has never actually made a decision. It is
actually really quite strange that we are at such an incredible point of technology that we went through a period in which, we had a mass expansion of CCTV cameras and so forth, and then the police aren't using them.
Yeah.
It is a very, very weird thing that they took all of the political hits for putting up CCTV all over the place, but then they aren't ensuring the public gets the benefit of them, which is just a very, very strange state of affairs. It's why you're right that it's part ideological, but it's also just part complete systems failure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult to draw any ideology out of, well, why put the CCTV cameras up in the first place if you're not going to use any of them? It is also the case, of course, that, just as you say, the technological possibilities here, the fact that we could solve a huge number of crimes if we were so inclined, and the government was happy to invest in doing so, and that the methods were adopted to do so as well, and the technologies employed to do so, there really is a significant amount of low-hanging fruit, which can be shown just simply by months of me hearing that it was too difficult to go after phone thieves, and actually very difficult because they wear balaclavas and they're on bikes and so forth. And then it turns out one single operation can arrest 230 people. And exactly as you say, there is very good reason to do this. About 1 in 10 offenders are responsible for over half of all crime. So, it's actually 9% of offenders are responsible for over half of all crime in this country. These are people who have 15 or more offences to their name, some of which have literally hundreds of offences to their name. They are more likely to avoid prison now than they were in 2007. They are much more likely to, I think it's about 5 times more likely to avoid prison than they were in 2007. This is absolutely astounding. These individuals, though, the fact that there is a small number responsible for such a large amount of crime means that if we were to concentrate efforts, we could radically reduce, or rather, as I name the campaign, we could crush crime rates by focusing on this small number of career criminals. And in fact, at times when this is done, it bears immediate fruit. The City of London, there was a bike theft gang. They arrested about, I think it was 7 people. and bike thefts fell by 90% as a result. Similarly, there are towns all over the country where they focused on career criminals active in the center, in the town center, often on the high streets. And they found by just concentrating efforts on these people, sometimes it's only 40 people are arrested and crime rates drop by 60%. It is incredibly possible to dramatically crush crime rates by focusing on these career criminals with 15 or more offenses. And it is very difficult to find any real reason, as you say, beyond system failure and beyond a very, very small number of people who are ideologically committed to, even if you have 15 or more offenses, you should be free to roam the streets repeatedly. There really is not much of a political coalition stopping this. It is actually just, I think, bringing the issue to salience, and it is making it clear to politicians that the public wants it and that they actually should spend some time, as you say, rather than pushing it down the road all the time. They actually should spend time concentrating on this and ensuring that people don't have to do things like adopt increasingly difficult phone cases or wraps around their necks with their phones on them, or just basically give up on owning a bike or only spending 20 quid on a bike, or for much more serious offenses, living in fear. There is absolutely no reason for that. By concentrating on just a small number of people, you can eradicate a vast, vast amount of crime.
I think that the standard that politicians have held themselves to post-forensics revolution is not, are we crushing crime to the extent that we could, given the tools available to us, but rather, is crime much higher than it was under the previous government? And they think, not really. And some of that is to do, I'm sure you'll know that the reason that murder rates don't look as bad as they might have done in previous decades is because trauma care has improved so much. I think this particularly was post-Iraq War, that trauma surgical techniques were refined and brought back to Britain. And there are some trauma centres in London that are superb, world class. And it means that people who would otherwise have died from particularly stab injuries are now surviving. And so murder doesn't look as bad as it kind of is. Or people are being convicted of GBH who would have been convicted, or of attempted murder who would have been convicted of murder if not for effective medical care. So, but I think that all of this, to some extent, conceals quite how bad things are, and politicians therefore have a tendency to say, whatever, it's basically fine. And I think also there's a very deep-seated feeling, which is ideological, that it's low status to care too much about crime.
I think that's 100% true. I think it is seen as low status to care about crime. It is seen as not really something permissible for elite people to talk about. And if you are talking about it, it's a bit of a negative against you in some way. For a very long period of time, there was actually a really interesting examples about this on, the attitude is very much like this is a tabloid issue.
Yeah.
It's kind of the way of conceiving of it, which is of course just horrendously dismissive of people who actually, because obviously crime is also, it's worse in some areas than others, and different types of crime are worse in different areas. Speaking to my parents who don't live in London, they live in a small town. Phone theft for them is not a big deal. In the city, though, it's happening all the time, right? But there are different types of crimes near them, different types of thefts and assaults and other kind of offences. But I think for a large number of politicians and for elites in general, it was seen, and still is to some extent, seen as low status to talk about, low status to care about. And that certainly, if you think the solution is to protect the public, putting people behind bars, this just screams, oh, this is, reactionary. It's actually just, a mistaken belief. Things are much more complex than that, actually. And we need to be much more complicated in our reasoning on this, which is, I think, something which, unfortunately, I've met many, many times. I met it in the Bully XL campaign. I've met it in other campaigns as well as in academia and other places, that essentially there is often a mist, like an obfuscating mist of, it's actually much more complex. And if you don't believe that, that's because you're not very clever, you're not very high status. And it is also, of course, the case that there is an ideological element to it. I don't want to downplay that is very, very true. We can see that right now, that even in the midst of much more focus on crime, much more discussion on crime, the interim sentencing review by government states that the issue in this country one of the central problems in this country is that we've been too tough on crime for too long.
Oh dear. So is that a Labour report, or is it cross-party?
Yeah. Well, I mean, written by Gork, who was, of course, previously with the Conservatives.
Okay, yeah. I mean, they're as bad as each other, to be honest. This is real uni-party stuff when it comes to crime.
It's extremely, to hear the problem has been that we have been too. I think the phrase was something like prison populism or something like this. The idea that and that we have been too tough on crime. That's been the problem in Britain. It is very difficult to find anyone outside of a very particular circle in Westminster that actually thinks that is true. The stats certainly don't bear it out. The public's own life experience does not bear this out. It is very difficult to find even people I know who are lifelong Labour voters. They certainly do not think that Britain has been too tough on crime for too long. But this is clearly an ideological push. It is also the case that consistent governments have failed to build prisons. They've, failed to invest in criminal justice, certainly to the degree the British public would like. If you ask the British public where they're most happy for their money to go, first is NHS, second trades between education and crime, criminal justice. Of course, that is not the way the budgets are structured at all. That is certainly not the case. Given this, it is something in which the British public's expectations are completely different to the government's, and they have not met these. Any government has, for a very significant amount of time. So they either have to invest heavily, they have to invest, and I mean both, not just money, but time, thought, putting together actual bills, acts of parliament to address a bunch of problems. They might have to have awkward discussions with the judiciary about expectations, what has to happen in the future, also try to attract more people to be judges, all these kind of different issues that there are in the system, and address all of these, as well as actually build more prisons that they failed to do for the last nearly 20 years. Or, it's pretty good if you have a particular ideology that lets you say, actually, that's not the problem. The problem is we've got too high expectations of, tough on crime, and we've been too tough, and actually we need to be much, much more relaxed, and stop using prison as this solution, which it just clearly isn't, and instead move on to something else. So you have like a awful political pragmatism of, I don't want to have to deal with the actual problem, matched with, and some people ideologically think this, and you can kind of use one to obfuscate the other.
Yeah, like an unholy alliance between those two instincts. This deep-seated idea that it's low status to be tabloidy about crime. I honestly, this is one of my most left-wing opinions. I think that snobbery in this country goes so deep. And one of the things that makes you more likely to be a victim of crime, I think this is true everywhere, is being poor.
Yeah.
You're less able to defend yourself from it, and you're forced to live in areas which are dangerous. And the fact that this just doesn't seem to register as a sort of quote unquote social justice issue, and also that the snobbery. I mean, like Enemy of the Pod, the Secret Barrister, and those like him, who's for those who don't know, is a secret barrister, author, tweeter, whatever, and has basically made a living in terms of his media life, of insisting that anyone who has any complaints against the criminal justice system just doesn't understand it. It's just too thick, basically. And if you don't have a law degree, and if you haven't had as much exposure to the criminal justice system as him, you just couldn't possibly understand. It's very complicated. And any kind of instinct towards being harder on crime is expressive of your own chaviness, basically, right?
Yeah.
And it just drives me crazy. It drives me crazy. The only area where this is sort of a carve out is when it comes to violence against women.
Yes. That is the only area where there is a very clear elite coalition.
Depending on who does it, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Also true.
Yeah.
Also true. It really is the case that it is seen as very low status, that it is seen as tabloid. This is enough, bizarrely, to just mean it isn't given any focus or time.
Yeah.
This is something I really found in the Bully XL campaign, and I was particularly concerned about, because all of the stories about the Dangerous Dogs Act. So when I ran the Bully XL campaign, when I started kind of campaigning, by accident, basically, and just wanted this problem solved. These dogs that we were importing that were suddenly responsible for the largest increase ever and the highest number of deaths of dogs ever in British history, and of which the vast majority of all of these deaths were down to one breed of dog, the American Bully XL, which was a tiny fraction of the dog population, which came from dog breed fighting pit bulls inbred repeatedly for larger and larger sizes and strength. These went on to kill a great number of people, including children, and the violence was absolutely horrific. And of course, they injure many people, and of course, they kill a lot of other pets and other dogs. But the Dangerous Dogs Act that banned pit bulls in this country back in the 1990s, I knew of because as a law student, we were taught about it as an example of bad law. And the reason why it was bad law was because it was passed very quickly on the back of a tabloid campaign or, tabloid press attention, and hadn't been thought through and therefore doesn't work. Our campaign actually showed that you could argue either way really for quite some time. But actually, if I show you a graph of fatalities in this country, deaths of dogs, and I just ask you, guess a 2 or 3 year zone when a pit bull type comes back into the country, you can get it exact because the number just immediately spikes and it maintains at that height. However, the big concern in the campaign for me was, how do I get government to do something on this when everyone, not just all of academia and all the charities on the specific issue itself, were against it, said that breed bans don't work. They didn't believe that, large numbers of them just didn't believe that dog breeds were real. Had an argument with an academic who said that,
Blank slatus about dogs.
Yeah, I had one academic tell me very confidently that herding behavior is weakly correlated with breed. I was just, this is like clearly, it's just this complete nonsense, very, very clearly. Mm-hmm. But have all of that and all the terrible things like they don't measure fatalities. They have their own measurement of bites, because if you measure fatalities, breed clearly is important. If you measure bites, you can claim Labradors bite more people, and yes, that's because there's more of them.
I have been bitten by a Chihuahua.
Yes, also Chihuahuas.
Yeah,
Chihuahuas do bite a lot of people.
They're really snappy, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if they were very large dogs, we should be very, very scared. Yeah. But with this, the other side of it wasn't just that you had all these arguments about, well, it's much more complex, and actually it's a whole, like, several of them wanted to argue things like, it's a societal wide issue about the relationship of people and dogs and like all this stuff. Mm-hmm. Whereas you also had, and a big concern of mine was, the general atmosphere had been for years and years and years that the Dangerous Dogs Act was extremely low status and the example of tabloid low status lawmaking that didn't work. And so a large part of the campaign, kind of my messaging and my approach, was that midwit meme I tried to focus on here, where I was like, okay, I want to make it very clear that the elite opinion is, no, it's actually very simple. Because everybody likes to be the contrarian. Yeah. The more elite you are, the more you like to be the contrarian, right? So it's like, the first stage is, well, it's actually much more complex than just banning a breed. And then the next stage up is, actually, no, it's not more complex. It's actually really simple. And this was like a real focus that I wanted to make it a much higher status issue. Mm-hmm. And crime in general, I think, is something which would benefit a lot from that. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways in which I think it does is actually because the government has been so bad, and the justice system in general is so bad at dealing with crimes that do affect elites. Mm. They have given up on phone theft and bike theft. And if you're in the middle of the city and you have a bike and a phone, if you've got an expensive phone or an expensive bike, it's almost certainly been stolen, and you've almost certainly met a justice system that's done nothing for you. Mm. And it's even worse than that. I was called just recently by someone who actually lives in Notting Hill, and her 2022 red Porsche was stolen, and police didn't even check CCTV. They just gave her a crime number and left.
Wow.
And what happens to you in those situations? It suddenly doesn't matter if it's low status or high status. You just want it solved. And so I think it becomes an issue that's around people's dinner tables, around politicians' dinner tables and elites' dinner tables. And I think that's the way that it is dramatically changing now.
I think that's true. And it also becomes an issue of tourism because increasingly people are associating London with this kind of crime, the phone snatchings in particular, and it becomes a. I mean, I always think soft power is just cope for people who don't have hard power, but it does seem as if our government is particularly preoccupied with soft power, and this is a problem for it. Yeah, I mean, yes, I obviously want it to become high status as well, and I think that probably is the way to get around this. Although you can imagine a scenario where the crimes that affect elites. This, by the way, this is my theory as to why violence against women has been a carve out. It's not so much because female victims of crime are more sympathetic, although they are a bit. There's the women are wonderful cognitive bias, right, where people do tend to feel more sympathetic to women. I actually think that it's one of those areas of crime, though, where class doesn't really protect you. And
Yes.
upper middle class
Yes.
women are victims of
Yes.
sexual violence and domestic violence, maybe to a lesser extent, just as much as other women are, and so they care about it for that reason. Whereas there are
Yes.
lots of other areas of crime where you can basically be protected from it by virtue of your class and your affluence.
I think that's exactly true. I think it is the case that it is a category of crime which affects elites that they're not protected from. Of course, elites are not necessarily, I shouldn't say protected, they're not, protected from all crimes, but they are less likely. There's whole categories of crime that they are much less likely to encounter.
Mm-hmm.
I do also think, though, that we are in such a bad position here, and it is so extremely bad that the high status and low status arguments aren't so important here now,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it is at the moment such a level of failure that it is very difficult, apart from a very small number. Unfortunately, that small number it's seemingly very close to government,
Mm.
of people to actually state that this is anything but a real failure to capture and convict career criminals, but also just our most serious and most violent criminals.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.